LD. How are you?
I am good. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Looking forward to talking about the differences between our writing styles, which
Yeah,
is I think
definitely.
will be an interesting discussion because
Hmm.
I think based on what I've heard about the way you write, I think that we do things quite differently, which is it's impressive, right? That people can
Hmm.
write books in different ways and still be successful. Before we get into that, though, how long have you been writing and publishing?
I guess unofficially started writing around 2011. I wrote a short story that was for class as an elementary school teacher, and the students really, really liked it, and they said I should get it published. And so at first I was like, no, that's never going to happen. But then I kind of started pondering that and decided maybe I would. And so I took that little like 5, 6 page story and eventually added to it and expanded it and eventually turned it into a book. And then I officially published it in 2017.
Okay. Have you published anything since then?
Yeah, that one was my first book. I've released 6 books
Nice.
total. Book 7 is coming out at the end of February.
Okay. It's coming up fast.
Hmm.
It's just right around the corner. So what is it?
Yeah.
Fantasy, sci-fi type things, horror?
Um, it's a middle grade superhero series, so more in
Okay.
the science fiction realm. But I'm planning a fantasy series, which I'm really, really excited about.
How cool. That's exciting. But are you nervous to branch out to a new genre?
A little bit, yeah, definitely kind of dipping my toe in that water is a little nerve-wracking, but I've been very excited to try this story just because that's what I read the most.
I find myself reading a lot of I read both fantasy and sci-fi, but for some reason, when I'm writing a fantasy book, I prefer to listen to sci-fi, listen or read sci-fi. When I'm
Hmm.
writing sci-fi, I prefer to listen and read to fantasy. So I think it's
That's
maybe my
cool.
brain shying away from let's I think my comparisonitis has a tendency to take the book I'm reading and be like comparing it negatively to what I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah.
So whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. But let's talk a little
Mm.
bit about your writing process. What does
Yeah.
your writing process look like?
So generally, I start off like note taking and just working on that idea generation. And so I'll use like a note taking app to generate ideas and eventually take that and kind of outline it. Usually, I'll just do a general like 1 through 100 point outline, 4 acts. And then I usually take that and then I put it over into Scrivener. And Scrivener has like these little like plot point format that you can use for each chapter, and it lets you kind of like plan it out that way. And so after I have kind of each chapter planned out and kind of have a little blurb of what's going to go on in each chapter, I'll take that and then I start writing it chapter by chapter, generally chronologically. But there are times where I've, paused a chapter and gone to a different one because, writer's block or can't get a certain story beat down and decide to leave it and come back to it later. But generally, that's how I go from like notes to outline to writing.
So how far do you plan? Is it just a single book at a time, or I'm assuming some of the books you've written are in a series, correct? Or are they
Hmm.
all are
Yeah,
they all
no, I
so there's
planned several.
at the same time, kind of before
Yeah,
you start
yeah.
writing? Okay.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I had my first 5 or 6 planned before I'd even published the first one, and that was a pretty rough outline. It wasn't anything super concrete, but I had a general outline of what was going to happen in the first 5 or 6 books before I even published that first one.
So, have you found that your writing style has adjusted over time, or has it been relatively the same since you started roughly writing in 2011?
I think it's definitely grown a lot. I've definitely embraced that idea of getting major beats down, but allowing some of that creativity to come in. Whereas before I was a little bit more rigid in that. Um, but I'm still very much more of a planner. I like having a really set outline, but I have allowed myself to let the inspiration hit in the moment and come up with, interesting ideas or add things in as they come. As I've kind of become more, maybe confident is the word for it, but maybe just more experienced too.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Do you how what's the most you've ever strayed from one of your plans?
Not very far.
Not very.
Nothing more than maybe a scene or an idea for like a character trait or something like that. So nothing super major. Um, Generally, the outline, looks very similar to what the final product is. Um, but I have kind of, added things here or there, or, maybe a chapter even that wasn't originally planned, but I found something, interesting, and it kind of elongated and eventually just kind of grew into a new chapter or something that was added to it.
Oh, that's so interesting. So for me, like just a little bit of a from my perspective of writing.
Hmm.
So I don't plan anything really, at least definitely not in writing.
Hmm.
When you write these down, you do it digitally, it sounds
Yeah, yeah.
like you said, a note taking app, which I
Hmm.
think is great. I mean, if you're like me, I don't do paper. I lose paper the
Hmm.
moment I put anything on it.
Right.
Um, so the interesting thing about my books is, I mean, I've published five now, so not as many as you. Um, but
Yours are much longer though, so let's just make sure. Yours
they're
are
probably
way longer. Mine are more
unnecessarily long.
yeah.
But I think that's the life of a pantser or discovery writer. We'll use discovery writer because there's some people
Yes.
don't like the term pantser. I describe myself as a pantser because it's not my writing is not as eloquent as a discovery writer. I
There
don't
you
I
go.
can't claim that. Um, so I mean, with the experience with my first book, I just wrote something random. Had no idea what I was doing. I just wrote like 6,000 words of this random character doing something random. And I was like, wow, this is going to turn into a book. And it did, right? It turned into a trilogy with a prequel story. And the best way to describe the way I write is I don't think, which it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to some people. But like I take some time to think when I'm not writing, but when I'm writing, I can't think because if I
Hmm.
think, then I'm overthinking, and then I'm messing myself up. I'm flubbing up the writing. I can't write very eloquently and clearly. And I recognize I'm going to edit all later anyway.
Hmm.
And so normally with my stories, normally I say normally because it's not always the case. I
Hmm.
know what characters I'm starting with and where they're going to be at the end of the story. Like how will they have changed? Maybe what are their relationships with the other characters, whether they be the good or the bad and whatnot. And then I have no idea how they get there. All I
Hmm.
know is I have to end with them in this space. And
Yeah.
so, knowing that as I'm writing, all sorts of random curveballs appear in the story, which is fascinating. I mean, for me, that's
Hmm.
exciting, right? And I think, and I've heard other discovery writers and pantsers say this before, is they don't like to plan because that ruins the story for them, and that's how it is for
Oh,
me.
okay.
I don't want it to be ruined. I'm like the reader. I want to be surprised, and I'm constantly surprised. Like, oh, okay, well, interesting. I would have not planned. But one of the most notable examples in my current work in progress is one of the characters who I didn't think was going to be a main character, and I don't know, he still kind of isn't. But at the end, I intended on him dying, but instead he was possessed and he ended up escaping. I was like,
Oh,
okay, well, that was
yeah.
not expected. So now I had to figure out what that means. And it's
Yeah.
become a whole part of the story now. And it's
Right.
very involved with the plot, like has become part of the plot. And that works, right? That doesn't stress me out. It's just like I kind of go with the flow as long as I know by the end of certain stories or milestones, I have to have it wrapped up. And it's
Hmm.
worked so far. I don't know how it's worked, but somehow it has. There's a lot of people that read the trilogy, the Lightbearer Chronicles. They get to the third book and they say, "How did you plan all of that?" Like, there's things that in the third book tie back to things that are talked about at the beginning of the first book, and I say, "I don't know." My brain just kind of did it. And when I got to the end, I was like, well, that's interesting. The reason it's interesting is because at the beginning of book one, I had no idea what the third book was even about. I didn't even know where
Hmm.
I was going. I didn't know what the third book was about until I finished the second book. It's like, well, now let's see what this means. And it just kind of all flowed and worked together. So kind of strange.
That's so
But
cool.
when I think about it, like outside of the writing experience, I get ideas for some things.
Hmm.
And this is probably terrible advice for any people listening, but I don't write anything down. If I get an idea while I'm doing dishes or showering or something, I chalk it up to if I remember that idea while I'm writing, then it's meant to be. If I forget it, it's not meant to be in the book. And
Hmm.
so there have been who knows how many ideas I get while I'm
Right.
thinking that I just forget. and they just
Yeah.
don't get become a part of the book. And that's just for
Hmm.
me part of the natural process.
Yeah.
So hearing that, I guess, what are your impressions? Would you be stressed out to write in that way? I'm just so curious.
I think so. I think I'm so type A and kind of a planner in life too that I think it would be a maybe a difficult process, but it would be a writing exercise that would be very challenging for me to try and endeavor 100,000 word book and not have any idea. Like right now, I'm planning the next series. It's going to be high fantasy, dragons and knights and magic and everything. And I'm doing so much planning, like more planning than I've ever done in my life for um, the superhero series, just because I have to create the world, create the religion, have to create the magic system, have to create like history. I like just wrote like an 11-page document on like the history that's probably never going to be talked about more than like a line here or there. But I think diving into something that big for me would be definitely challenging. It'd be interesting, and I would be excited to maybe try something like that. But yeah, I don't know how far I would get and how much would come in the way. And I think I would get in my own way because I would try and um, overplan and then overcompensate. And I don't know how it would go for me because I've just kind of gotten to that routine of, planning and plotting and everything. But like there are so many great discovery writers that have done some amazing stories like J.R.R. Tolkien or not George R.R. Martin and everything, like one of the most famous, fantasy series of our day, and he's completely a discovery writer.
Stephen King as well as a notable example,
Hmm.
and that the fact he writes like a machine, like six
He
pages a day.
does.
I
Oh
think
my
he
gosh,
said, I
yeah.
can't imagine writing 6 pages a
Hmm.
day. But I try and think about your experience. I think I would just not finish books. Like, to be
Hmm.
completely frank, I think I would plan out books and be like, oh yeah, this is a great story, and then I wouldn't write it
Hmm.
because I wouldn't want to. I already know the story. Like, there's no motivation for me to write a story that I already know is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not interesting to me. It's like,
Right.
which I find so ironic because my personality, I reread books all the time.
Hmm.
Like, I love rereading books,
Oh yeah.
but something about writing it just feels so big when I
Hmm.
have to redo the whole thing and put it in
Yeah.
words. Like, nah, I don't want to do that. I don't want to take the time to do that. Maybe it's laziness on my part. I don't know. We can call it that.
I mean, motivation is such a huge aspect of it. Like, I did NaNoWriMo last year, and because I was like super motivated and interested in trying to finish it, like I wrote faster and better than I
Mm.
think I've ever done in my life, and it was just like really interesting writing experience to like have that much motivation. Because like I was on TikTok and I saw other people posting about it and sharing stuff, and so like that kind of fueled that motivation. So that motivation I think is so key for a writer. And like you said, if that kills the motivation, then that's going to be all you need to not get the book done.
Absolutely. Now, I've not tried to plan any books. I've tried to plan chapters, and I
Hmm.
immediately threw them out and went a completely different way.
Yeah.
Like, my brain just shied away from that. All planning would probably do is tell me how the story was not going to be.
Right. Yeah.
And since there's so many possibilities, I'm just not going to take my time to do
Hmm.
that. So I'm curious from your perspective because I don't have a planner brain in my normal life even either. My wife is the planner. Our
Hmm.
personalities are wildly different. Um, and she's the one that wants everything planned to a T, and I'm the guy that's like, yeah, we'll figure it out as we go. And she just cannot handle that. So there's advantages to both, right?
Hmm.
Being disorganized on my part isn't always the greatest. She's always very organized. On the bright side, when things go wrong, I'm not affected. She's like, I don't
Hmm.
care. It's not a big deal. Just move on. Whereas she's very stressed. Like, I don't know how to deal with that change, right? Because I was so prepared for X, and X didn't happen. So it's kind of interesting to think about it from that perspective. So for you, when you're planning, do you have to reach a certain point within each chapter before you feel comfortable writing it? And what is that point? Like, how do you know I have enough of a plan to start writing this?
Um, I think to start the chapter, I do have to have enough of a plan of where it's going to go, but I've definitely hit that point where I don't know where it's going to go, and I've had to pause. And like I was saying before, I've had to like, sometimes stop a chapter because I don't know where it's going to go, and I'll have to jump to a point in the story where I know it's going to pick back up or do the little thing where I put brackets and be like, something happens where he gets to this part of the city or gets to this part in the story, and then figure it out later, and kind of go from there. But I've definitely had that hit where it's like, I don't know where this is going to go, and I need to figure that out before I can move on with at least this section of the story. Because otherwise, it's to me as a planner, it's like I know I have to get to this point, and until I figure that out, I can't move on. So I definitely hit that kind of paralysis when I'm writing.
So that's interesting. It sounds like you mentioned a couple. There's not a great solution to that because that's not quite writer's block. It's just kind of like I don't know where to go now. So is your
Hmm.
solution then to just pick up with a different scene always, or like are there other solutions to you kind of hitting a wall with your plan and not knowing what to do? What kind of things do you do to spur that creativity?
Um, if going to a new chapter isn't working or starting another part of the book, sometimes I will work on something completely different. Sometimes, removing yourself from the problem at hand is
Yeah.
my solution. So I'll go do something else. I'll, whether it be like working out or playing a video game or doing another activity that is removed from it and um, still can allow me to be thinking creative and planning and things like that. Whether it be like playing something like Minecraft where I don't really need to focus on the game mechanics. I can just kind of zen and kind of focus on something else in my back of my head, or something like that. That sometimes will help, but usually I will go to a different chapter and go from there, to maybe part of the story where I know like this is what's going to happen. Maybe it be a fight scene or a dialogue between two characters that I know this is how it's going to kind of plan out. I don't know how the characters get to each other at the point, but kind of know this is what they're going to talk about when they get there. Um, and then I'll just kind of go from there and then kind of backtrack after.
So fascinating, right? I can't imagine planning out conversations.
Hmm.
That just to me, I don't even know how my brain could even process that level of detail because I don't think in that level of okay. I'm gonna just take a step back here. Some of you listening may be laughing who know me. I'm an operations manager, a technical operations manager by profession. So the detail is where I'm successful in work, which is so ironic because I don't
Yeah.
do the planning detail outside of work. So I don't know how I don't try to understand the way my brain works. It just does. Um, but music, do you find inspiration in music
Hmm.
as your so what kind of music do you listen to? Does it depend on the story? Does it depend on the scene? What do you go to when you need that inspiration from music?
It's got to be instrumental. I don't listen to
Yes.
anything with words when I'm writing. I can't. If I'm listening to words, I don't focus on the writing. But I'll listen to something, more intense, more upbeat. Something might be from a soundtrack with like that's a fight scene, or just something that's more, intense if it's a fight scene. If it's more, just normal dialogue or characters like looking for clues and things like that, it can be low key. But if I'm doing something more action oriented, I like to try and find something that's a little bit more exciting and upbeat that can kind of flow and let those two things kind of like feed off each other a little bit. Um, but yeah, I love listening to instrumental stuff, a bunch of instrumental playlists or things like that on my phone and stuff that I usually go to when I'm in the writing space.
I think that's great. I should create playlists. Once again, that's an organized thing. I don't organize. I enjoy music too, and I agree. Instrumental, I think this is just the way the human mind works. I know some people may listen to things with words, but it does distract you, right? When you're trying to
Hmm.
write words, you can't be listening to words. Now,
Yeah.
occasionally when I get into the writing scene, so I start radios on mine. I have some starter songs, I call them, when I need to get into a writing session. I plug in both headphones with some noise canceling and I close my eyes and I just listen to the song and I don't think. I just let my mind do whatever it wants. And so normally the way the music moves and the beats and the chord progression, everything comes up with a story in my head, completely random story, different characters, events that I'm still learning. And it's actually a fun game that I could probably play forever. I'll get into that in just a second. But doing that gets me into the writing mood. And then normally I just start writing, continuing on the scene that I'm working on, and I let the music play. So sometimes things with words pop on, and I just not even paying attention. I'm so focused on the writing I don't even realize that there are words. It's quiet enough that it's not a big deal.
Hmm.
But if the words distract me, I do turn them off. I don't intentionally find things with words. Normally, if you start with instrumental, it'll keep playing instrumental. Um, but anyway, just a little bit of step back the way my creator brain works. I was doing some service work in the Philippines a little while ago, and some of my roommates there realized how interesting my brain was. This was before I even wrote. I didn't even know I was going to be an author. I wanted to, but I never thought I would. Um, they found it so fascinating to let me listen to a song that they chose, and then they wanted me to describe what I saw, and they were like hanging on every word that I came up with. They're like, how on earth do you come up with this? Like, I have no idea. The music just like takes my brain places, and I just told them what stories were created from the music, and they thought it was fascinating. So that's just how it works. That's how my books
Yeah.
work. The unfortunate thing is I have no idea how long my books are.
Hmm.
It's a problem, right? Sunfire, which is the single sci-fi-ish book that I've written for young adults, it was supposed to be 60,000 words and it ended up being 98. So I missed that quite a bit. Um, and then for my fantasy books, I just don't, I can't even set a word count because I
Hmm.
don't know. Right now I'm at 137,000 of this one, and it's kind of near the end, I think. Like I'm getting a feel that it's near the end. But I don't know. It could be another
Yeah.
30,000. It could be another 10. Just kind of depends on what happens.
Right.
So, so do you know, like, do you have target word counts and you're able to hit those targets pretty easily with your plan?
Yeah, usually I have a number in my head for chapters that I try and hit. And then for my like overall, I have a general idea. And so I can just kind of do the math like, okay, this many chapters, they're usually about 2,000 words. That should be about this money based on how many chapters I have. So I'll have a rough estimate, and it might be off by, 1,000 or 2,000, but it's generally pretty close to what the outline looks like when I'm writing.
That's negligible, 1,000 words compared
Hmm.
to the
Right.
what I end up coming up with.
Yeah, right.
So this is probably a really weird question. You've probably never been asked, but side characters. So do you find that your plots are pretty straight shooters? I mean, side characters are always there. They're going to be. They're just kind of necessary for stories. But do you find that you don't have a crazy amount of side characters in your story with you
And
planning?
yeah, and my current one that the middle grade superhero series that I'm working on, yeah, there aren't a ton. It's because it's middle grade. I don't have a ton going on. I've tried to keep
Sure.
it not necessarily simple, but more linear than a lot of tangents, and a lot of side plots and other things going on. So there are just a core group of people that are involved, and the specific villain and the mission that they're on and things like that, so it's a little bit more linear than your traditional fantasy that has tons of subplots and lots of side characters. The series that I'm planning right now has a lot of characters, but so it'll be interesting to see kind of like the differences between those two.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, obviously everybody has different writing process. I don't know that there's necessarily true plotters versus true pantsers. Like I think we're all kind of a mix of
Hmm.
something, which
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
fascinating, right? So I would have this conversation with a different plotter and it would still be completely different, right?
Hmm.
Which is great. It's so fascinating, the writing process. But it does make me wonder because I can't even count the number of side characters that just appeared out of nowhere in my fantasy series, like completely out of nowhere. One of the teenage um characters in my fantasy series, he's one of the three main characters. Um a a crush appeared out of nowhere. I was like, that was not like why? But yeah, it just appeared out of nowhere, became a really important part of the third book, and then part of some of the twists that happened at the end. Once again, I didn't plan for them until they were right there in front of me. So there's just so many side characters that just come out of nowhere as they interact with the characters, and then I don't know. There's just like this moral obligation in my brain to keep them, even though
Hmm.
it's silly. Like I don't have to. I can cut them out whenever I want. But yeah, there's just a challenge with that with me because obviously people interact with people as they're running into them and different things are happening. And so yeah, I feel like side characters just appear out of nowhere all the time for
Yeah,
me. Could you name all of the side characters in your fantasy series by
I
the
think
time you're
so.
done? You think you could?
I
Okay.
think as of right now, yeah, I can.
Impressive.
I can definitely name the ones in the middle grade superhero series because it's not that numerous. But yeah, no, I think I could name everybody.
Fascinating. So editing, let's get into editing. First, I don't like editing. It's just, ugh, I don't like it. It's not my favorite thing because once again, it comes back to the I know what happens in the story.
Right.
I don't want to redo it because I already know what happens type of thing. But for you, do you find the editing process is relatively smooth because you've planned everything out and it's so structured that there's just not as many story plot problems?
Yeah, I think so. I don't mind the editing as much. But it does go through a lot of different steps because I have, different groups of people reading at different times and everything. But sometimes I'm on book 10, whereas they're reading book 7 right now and things like that. So sometimes it's like I have to go back to my notes and find that, but usually it's fairly straightforward. It's usually a little bit just sometimes a little bit of legwork to find the exact spot and refresh my memory. Because like you said, it is pretty well planned out. Maybe too much so even.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it just depends on your preference. Some people may
Hmm.
think it's too much. Some people may not think it's too much. For me, it's too much. All right, I can say that. That's just preference. I think that's interesting, though. I mean, it would make sense logically that editing might not be as much of a problem for someone who plans. Um, I edit intuitively
Hmm.
the way I write, which once again, whether or not it works, I don't know. Obviously, no book's perfect. We're all learning, and that's
Hmm.
great. But yeah, I approach my editing the way I write, where I read through the whole thing. So I finish writing it, I set it aside for time period. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months. It just depends on how long I feel I need to step away from it. When I come
Hmm.
back to it, I just read through it like I'm a reader. And if there's anything that feels weird or is boring, I'm just like, oh, this isn't working, right? Like cut it out
Hmm.
or change it or maybe add a couple things. But I don't plan anything, or I don't make a mark and say I'll come back and fix that later. I just fix it right then as I'm
Hmm.
writing it because I don't want to come back to it.
Yeah.
And then I leverage Pro Writing Aid for the grammatical stuff. I don't know if you've ever
Hmm.
used Pro Writing Aid or like
I've heard of it. I
autocorrect
haven't used that one
reading
yet.
Grammarly or things like
Hmm.
that. So I'm terrible at grammar. Spelling's fine. There's tons of typos because I type really fast while I'm writing.
Hmm.
Um, but other than that, yeah, I don't try to understand how commas work. So normally I mean my writing sessions are I try to go for about 30 minutes to 45 minutes a day. And usually in that time I can get about 1200 to 1800 words in about 30 to 45 minutes. So I'm typing so fast that I don't know, I'm making tons of mistakes.
Hmm.
You can imagine the first read through is kind of like a whoa, what was I can
Right.
always understand what I was going for, but some of the words are so crazy misspelled. So for you, when you come back and edit it the first time, and it's relatively easy. Uh, how quickly can you get through and edit your first edit and maybe all the edits after that? Does it go pretty quick?
Yeah, it usually goes pretty quickly. I have a nice team of like beta readers that read for me and they'll
Oh,
help give me
nice.
some feedback on stuff like that. Um, and sometimes I just ask them like, hey, read through and give me like your general feeling on things and, whether you like this or that. But a lot of them I have, yeah, I don't know if it's just very lucky or if it's just something that they really like to do or what, but they're really good about like giving me like notes on certain things, whether it be grammatical or just like the flow of a sentence and things like that. So that's been really like helpful as far as that's concerned. But the editing definitely is something that I do enjoy, but because it isn't as creative of an aspect as the actual writing, it's more like work. Whereas like writing to me is enjoyable. It's really fun. It's um, that creative side of my brain that I like to get to tap into, and that I really, really love. Um, and although I'm very type A, I love getting to get into that field and getting to play with the creative side and like play around with things like that. But editing is definitely work and it's being methodical, it's being slow and kind of like rereading things like that. And like you said, it's something that like the motivation isn't always there to go back and do that. So it can be a challenge in that. And um it's more of like when I go to sit down to write, I'm excited. I really enjoy it. I want to do it. But editing, it's like, okay, I have to sit down and edit now. I have to spend some time and uh, plan, and then that's the one where I have to kind of like check myself a little bit more and like turn everything off and make sure that I'm like focusing, because I will get distracted, and it's not as enjoyable as just the writing process for me.
Well, I think that's probably the case for a lot of people, although there are some strange people that love the editing process. I can think of one specific author friend that I have who just
Yeah.
loves the process. I'm like, you are crazy. No, it's great. I think it's great. Everyone has strengths in different areas. I think it's
Hmm.
amazing that that's his preferred process and he loves it. That's awesome. I ask him to share some of that enthusiasm with me every time I'm in the editing phase because
Right.
I just don't love it. It's just not my favorite. Um, but there's just so many people listening. There's so many different ways to write, and if you've never written before, take encouragement that if you don't know what your writing process is, that's okay.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes you just have to figure it out and
Yeah,
trust
definitely.
that the process that you're going with is the right one intuitively. Like if you try to plan and it's just not working, you're not motivated, you hate it, then just try not planning. Vice versa, if you're trying to just figuring it out as you go and you don't find the motivation, you're having a hard time writing, try planning, right? Try the other thing, but go with what you're feeling.
Hmm.
I think most writers will eventually, after you've written even the first draft of the first one, you kind of realize, oh, this is the type of person I am, this is the type
Hmm.
of way I want to write my book, and then go with it, right? There's tons of books out there about plotting and planning, and you can read those and try them out, and if they don't work for you, don't feel guilty. Just don't do it, right?
Yeah,
If they work
absolutely.
for you, that's awesome. Have you read Save the Cat by any chance? I know that's kind of a popular plotter
I've heard of
book.
it. I haven't, that one's on my
Okay.
TBR, but I haven't read it yet.
It was on my TBR until I was like, no, I'm not gonna. I'm probably never gonna plan. I'm just gonna be honest with myself.
Right.
But I found a book recently. I talked about it on my podcast a couple times ago about intuitive writing. It's the only book I've seen so far, and I'm fascinated by it. So I'm going to be reading that next. I'll let you know how
Nice.
it goes. But
Hmm.
most books about writing are plotting, planning,
Hmm.
very organized, which is great.
Right.
I mean, there's a method to some of these things. So if you read Save the Cat, let me know what
Yeah,
you think.
definitely. I'll have to check that one out.
You found that it was helpful. So do you have any advice for someone who is getting started with writing and maybe they're recognizing that they are a planner or they want to plan out their books? Do you have any recommendations for systems to use or a process that might be a good way for them to start?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the big ones is kind of um, find a system like you said that works for you. I use Evernote because it organizes it into notebooks, and I really like that because you'll have a notebook that is book one, and then it has notes inside of it, so I can have like a note on characters, on settings, and themes and things like that, and I can have just a ton in there. Um, and that's the one that works for me because it's kind of organized. You can like tag things so that way it's easy to find and stuff like that. And so that kind of like lends itself to my brain and how I like to plan things. But I think go in knowing that, your first draft might not be your best, and give it your all, and then take some time, like you said, put it aside for a couple of days, couple of weeks, and come back at it knowing that, your first draft will not be your best. You're gonna want to make changes, but don't be discouraged. I rewrote my first book at least three times before I liked it, because the pacing was weird and I couldn't get certain characters to where I wanted them to be and needed them to be, and it to
Mm,
seem organic and make sense. Um, and so like, it's a process, and keep plugging away and keep trying, and like you said, find what works for you, and whether that be um you know finding a note app or writing it by hand, do what works for you and what helps your creativity. And like we said before about motivation, if the motivation isn't coming from planning, try being a discovery writer, try other things until you find what motivates you.
hmm Absolutely. Definitely remember that writing should be enjoyable. If you're not
Hmm.
enjoying writing, then something's wrong.
Yeah.
You need to
Hmm.
take a step back and reevaluate why you're writing and what you're writing and if it's the right move for you. So
Hmm.
I think this is great. So I appreciate the time. I feel like we could probably talk forever about this. There's so many
Yeah,
comparisons that we didn't even get to, but we are running
right.
short
Yeah.
on time. Before we go, where can people find more information about you and your books if they want to check them out?
Yeah. You can check me out on most socials, LD Valencia. And then I'm on Amazon, LD Valencia. My current series is called the Gifted World book series. It's kind of similar to like My Hero Academia and Mission Impossible meets Marvel kind of thing. Um, but yeah, check them out if you are into that.
Very good. You have a website or anything to share? Maybe
I do have a
not yet.
website, El Danny Valencia, but I don't use it very much nowadays.
Fair
So
enough.
most of my social medias is what I use to put content out, let people know what's going on. I need to start getting up on my newsletter because that's something that, like I was saying before, like it's work, so I don't want to do it. But I need to kind of get my newsletter going and start
Yes.
actually sending newsletters out more.
Reach into the choir. Yeah, I totally
Hmm.
get that. Well, great. Thanks so much for your time. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on and getting to talk about some of the differences in our writing styles and just kind of getting to talk about how, it's a process and whatever yours looks like, it's as long as it's motivating and it's fun, enjoy it.
Yeah, it was definitely great.